If you're concerned about how overweight you are and want to get down to a healthier level, what's the best way of knowing that you're hitting the mark? There's actually been a huge argument amongst experts between those who think that all that matters is your waist circumference, while others think it's your body mass index, your BMI. That's your weight in kilograms divided by your height in squared metres. I spoke to Dr. Andrew Rundle, a public health researcher at Columbia University in New York, who disagrees. He thinks BMI is the way to go.
BMI is easy to measure and you can keep track of it yourself, so you can set goals for yourself, and that's one of the ways we think inspires better health behaviors. BMI was as good as the other measures of predicting the health outcomes, and it is a simple measure that you can measure for yourself at home without having to go to a doctor's office.
But waist circumference is fairly easy too.
Well, it involves finding landmarks on your body between your rib and your pelvic bone, and then picking a spot between there. And there's sort of 4 different clinical ways you can do that. And then every time that you measure your waist circumference to keep track of it, you've got to keep that tape parallel to the ground at the same spot. So it's harder to do.
There is an issue though with BMI for people who are carrying a lot of their weight in muscle, elite athletes for example.
If you have a lot of muscle mass, then the BMI becomes a less accurate indicator of your health. So if we look at somebody like Arnold Schwarzenegger when he won Mr. Universe for the 4th or 5th time, if you look at his height and weight then, he was obese based on muscle mass. But you don't see many people who look like Arnold Schwarzenegger walking around the population. We don't suffer from an epidemic of buffness.
In studies in Australia, comparing suburbs where people work and go to school and shop separately to the place that they live, has demonstrated that on average, people living in mixed use areas are 6 kilos lighter than people living in areas where it's solely residential. Has your study found the same thing?
So we've focused on 3 things. Access to healthy food. So we have this concept of food deserts, which are areas in New York City where it's very difficult to buy healthy food because there's an absence of good grocery stores. Produce markets are just not there. And we've been looking at how a lack of access to food is associated with higher BMI. We've been looking at access to park space and recreational facilities and looking at how if your neighborhood has access to large, safe parks, whether that's associated with higher levels of physical activity, which it is. It's also associated with lower BMI. And we've been looking at this concept of neighborhood walkability. Neighborhood walkability is a concept from the urban planning literature that describes whether a neighborhood promotes pedestrian activity as a means of transportation.
In my age group, amongst my friends, I guess we are of an age and a socioeconomic group that are very conscious about exercise.
I do a lot of exercise, I surf and I walk, but that's about all I can do now.
If you're freed up from having to use a car to get through all of the daily things that you want to get through, you walk more, and walking is a form of activity that can be very helpful.
Most of our friends are walkers, so they walk, some play tennis, but they keep relatively active. I would say sort of 3 to 5 days a week they're doing some form of exercise.
In other cities across America, so there's data from Atlanta, there's data from Portland and Seattle, and our data is from New York City showing that mixed land use, the combination of residential, commercial, and retail in one area, in one neighborhood, is associated with higher levels of physical activity, predominantly through walking, and lower BMI. It frees you up from driving everywhere, and driving is just a sedentary behavior where you're really burning no calories. So yeah, we see that this idea of mixed use landform is associated with healthful behaviors related to obesity.
So have you also studied influences of the mother on obesity in children?
Absolutely. So an idea that's percolated to the surface recently is this idea that pollutants in our environment, when a pregnant woman is exposed to them, or when a child in the earliest years of life is exposed to these chemicals, that it may alter the growth trajectories of the child, how fast the child grows and gains weight through childhood.
So is your underlying idea that if the child doesn't grow well in the womb, then once it's born, it's prone to obesity because we overcompensate?
Right, so this is one theory. I don't think it's the only theory of why this works, and our data doesn't speak to which of those theories is correct. But what we are able to show is that women who have got higher levels of exposure to air pollution, specifically the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in air pollution, their children are more likely to be obese at age 5 and age 7. And this is not that the children have got more muscle mass, this is the children have got more fat mass. And so this is an effect of air pollution on the growth and acquisition of fat in the children.
So these hydrocarbons are coming from car fumes?
Right, so this is any kind of burning of fossil fuels, and so you think diesel fuel, but also from cigarette smoke. Any kind of burning of carbon products can produce polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons.
How can you be sure that what you're seeing isn't the poverty effect? Because women that are exposed to high levels of these chemicals are probably also living in low-income areas.
We try to be very careful about this. So the cohort of mothers that we work with are all from actually low-income neighborhoods. We know how much their income was. We know whether they were on social services, if they were receiving food benefits and things like that. We have the data on how wealthy their entire neighborhood is, so we could look at poverty rates, median household income. We know how much education the women have had. So we adjusted for all of those sort of obvious measures of differences in income and poverty, and that doesn't explain our results. In fact, between the peer review process, our own process, we couldn't find any variable related to sort of socio-demographic differences between the mothers that actually explain those results. There's also animal data, so there's very similar mouse data that shows that when pregnant mice are exposed to the same distribution of air pollutants that we saw in our study, that the mice gain weight as well. So there's actually parallel animal studies in mice that show almost identical results to our human studies in the children.
Are there any pollutants that are worse than others?
This is a brand new field. We've only recently begun working on this, and we as a scientific community have only recently begun working on this. So we've been looking at just the air pollution. We have new work on some of the plasticizers where we're still analyzing the data. But over the course of our study, we'll be looking at 3 or 4 different pollutants, and we'll be able to sort of have a hierarchy of what seems to be the worst of them and what happens with mixtures. So we can't just think of it as like chemical A, chemical B. We have to think about complex mixtures of chemicals, and that's what we're working towards understanding at the moment.